The Nintendo Switch is close to its expiry date. Based around the ancient Tegra X1 SoC, the Switch wasn't a particularly sprightly console, even when it debuted in early 2017. But the Switch's relatively modern graphics technology meant that the system could run recent titles without a massive development effort. On the flip side though, its meager levels of compute performance, which was a necessary compromise for a power-limited mobile device, often required huge compromises, in particular to rendering resolution. With the Switch reportedly soon to be replaced by a successor console, we thought we'd survey some of these efforts to see just how low res the most demanding titles got. Just how low can the Nintendo Switch go? First, some ground rules. We'll be evaluating games by how low the lowest typical resolution is in portable mode. For games with dynamic resolution, it is possible that they could go lower, but these pixel counts should be representative of the lowest resolutions in normal play. We're also limiting ourselves to native Switch software that renders out full 3D graphics. Finally, this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, more of a sampling of some of the lower resolution games out there. Our first game is firmly in standard definition territory. Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled renders at 854 by 480 in portable play, essentially a widescreen version of a 480p resolution. This is a good one to start with as we're getting pure unrefined pixels. There's no anti-aliasing whatsoever, just a straight 480p. When you're at a resolution this low, AA sometimes hurts more than it helps, so you will notice that several of these titles drop the technique entirely. In practice, Crash Team Racing often looks quite messy in motion on the Switch. The screen is flooded with jagged edges. On the plus side, it does still look fairly sharp, but it certainly does distract from what is otherwise a solid version of the kart racing remake. Our next title is The Witcher 3. This is one of the so-called impossible ports, a conversion that manages to squeeze a top-end title onto Nintendo's power-limited console. Most visual settings have been scaled down fairly elegantly, but there's no hiding the cutbacks to resolution. Our lower bound here is just 810 by 456, with the game typically hovering around 480p in portable mode. The Witcher 3 is a slower paced game that renders detail into the far distance and really demands a much higher level of precision in my view. By default, there's a fairly mediocre post-process AA enabled that does an okay job of cleaning up the image at the expense of some blurriness. Interestingly, many of the game's options can be disabled, including the anti-aliasing. It's not quite a PC settings menu, but it does give a surprising amount of flexibility. With everything dialed down, 576p seems like a more common typical resolution, and the game can actually reach a full 720p in some circumstances. A big improvement from the default, albeit at the cost of some key features. Regardless of how you choose to play, however, The Witcher 3 isn't a particularly clean experience. Open world titles benefit enormously from pixel-precise detailing, and Nintendo's console is simply not up to the task. We can go much lower than this, however. On paper, Mortal Kombat 11 is one of the most ambitious Switch conversions out there. It's a full-fat conversion of a sophisticated 60fps fighting game, and critically retains that 60fps refresh even on Switch. There are plenty of settings downgrades of course, but the slashed resolution is the most visually conspicuous problem. Mortal Kombat 11 renders at just 682 by 384 at lowest, which you'll typically see during cutscenes and fatality moves. It usually hovers between 384p and 480p in gameplay, though often towards the lower end of that range. Perhaps sensibly, anti-aliasing is dropped here as well, which gives the title a chunky but reasonably sharp look. This is a game that ships with clear compromises, but manages to deliver something special, a modern fighting game at 60fps on mobile hardware. Though resolutions may be fairly low here, it looks perfectly fine in the Switch's display for the most part. I tend to find that titles that lean into a lower resolution aesthetic scale pretty well on the small portable Switch screen. When games try to hide reduced pixel counts through techniques like TAA, lower resolutions sometimes paradoxically stand out a little bit more. Modern AA struggles to resolve clean detail at very low pixel counts, which is an issue that's highlighted in our next title, Doom Eternal. To be fair, Panic Button's quadrilogy of id Tech 6 games, Doom 2016, Wolfenstein 2, Wolfenstein Youngblood, and Doom Eternal are some of the most impressive efforts on Switch. In general, these ports retain most of the visual features fundamental to id Tech, but concede the battle on framerate, retreating from the 60 FPS target of other console versions. Now, these ports did manage to produce good results for the most part, but were perhaps most strained on Doom Eternal. This large-scale title required cuts to key post-processing features, like depth of field and motion blur. Moreover, the dynamic res system was put under serious strain, dipping to just 360p at its lowest in portable mode. Most gameplay proceeds somewhere between 360p and 480p or so, which means we're firmly in standard definition territory. This is backed up by a high-quality TAA, which ultimately has a bit of a mixed effect on the image. With so few pixels to work with, the final results look a little bit messy and soft, which stands out particularly in some of the larger arenas. It's still an impressive porting effort, but you get the sense that this is probably about as far as the Switch can be pushed before features or image quality completely slip away. For evidence of that, just look at WRC 8. The World Rally Championship games are somewhat infamous on Switch, with massive compromises relative to their home console counterparts. WRC 8 packs more background detail than later entries, but perhaps as a consequence image quality suffers. Again, this title dips to 360p at lowest, with resolutions often hovering not much above. Making matters worse, there's some aggressive sharpening at play, which serves to highlight the game's image quality faults. With a more careful reworking, I imagine image quality could be improved. Perhaps a re-implementation of key rendering systems to better suit the Switch would give the game enough headroom for higher res rendering. When I surveyed my Switch library, which contains over 400 titles, I found it difficult to find anything that actually went below 360p, which is the lower bound resolution of the prior two titles. Perhaps that's for a good reason. With half the resolution on each axis, games that render at 360p are actually rendering at 1/4 the overall pixel count of the Switch's built-in screen. That's a very low resolution indeed, and it seems like a sensible floor for dynamic resolution scalers. But I did manage to find 3 significant titles that do offer sub 360p rendering. First up is A Short Hike. This charming indie adventure offers a resolution of 426 by 240 on the Switch in portable mode, or just 11% of 720p. This super sharp but low res approach harkens back to the 3D rendering styles common on systems like the Nintendo DS. Stylistic concerns are of course key here. I can't imagine that the Switch is particularly taxed by this title, and other platforms display the game at similarly low resolutions. The next game is equally low res, but for perhaps less noble reasons. Ark Survival Evolved is a notoriously low quality port, with awful image quality and miserable frame rates. At lowest, I counted a resolution of 384 by 216, which is a mere 9% of 720p, though I imagine it could dip further in some circumstances. TAA is used to try to clean up the mess, but if anything I think it probably makes the game look a little bit worse. This is simply too few pixels to work with for even the highest quality TAA implementations to handle. Ark looks like a blurry mess, almost more like a painting than a game. Ark isn't particularly well behaved on any system, with questionable image quality and frame rates on other console platforms as well, but some odd decisions have been made here regardless. Relatively demanding post-process techniques, most notably screen space reflections and screen space ambient occlusion, have been retained. These are typically the first effects to get the boot in any taxing Switch conversion, but curiously they've been preserved for this title. With a more strategic approach, perhaps image quality could have been improved. Fortunately, there is some good news here. The publisher has taken the nearly unprecedented move of commissioning a brand new report of the game to Switch. Early off-screen footage looks promising, showcasing big improvements to draw distance and frame rate. We'll have to wait and see exactly what the final release looks like, of course, but it does seem like a substantial upgrade. There is one last title to discuss, the absolute lowest resolution 3D game I could find on the Switch. Retro shooter Throwback Dusk renders at 720p by default on the Switch's display, a perfect match for the panel with very good image quality. Delving into the game's advanced display settings, however, and you can set the resolution as low as 1/8 on each axis. On the Switch's 720p display, that means a rendering resolution of just 160 by 90, or an astoundingly low 1.6% of 720p. With a resolution beneath most graphing calculators, this is in seriously chunky territory, and the game itself is borderline unplayable in this mode. There's no anti-aliasing of course, and nearest neighbor scaling seems to be in use here, just like with a short hike, evenly scaling up the image by representing each virtual pixel with 64 display pixels. It's a curious and amusing option that's worth fiddling around with for a few minutes though, and some of the higher rendering fractions are perfectly viable to play with. In terms of true performance-constrained low-res rendering, however, the winner of this exercise has to be Ark Survival Evolved. I couldn't find any other graphically sophisticated titles that came particularly close to matching Ark's dismal pixel counts. With a full array of modern rendering features, a performance-sapping open-world simulation, and with perhaps less care and attention from the development team than it deserved, Ark shows the Switch simply pushed too hard. The limited Tegra X1 hardware can't cope with modern games like this without a more substantial reworking. Which got me thinking, how might a future Switch cope with similar challenges? The Switch itself is ancient hardware, a nearly 6-year-old console based on an 8-year-old chip, and is surely due for a replacement soon. I suspect advanced reconstruction techniques will be key to any Switch sequel. While we have seen TAAU-style techniques in the Switch, a Switch successor should pack enough compute to tackle more advanced upscaling tech like AMD's FSR 2.0, which produces more detailed images with low input resolutions. The elephant in the room there, of course, is NVIDIA's DLSS. With NVIDIA widely tipped to deliver future Switch SoCs, a version of NVIDIA's AI upsampling tech is a tantalizing possibility. We'll have to wait and see, but if NVIDIA can deliver a tuned version of DLSS suitable for an SoC that might only consume a few watts in portable play, that could give the system enough breathing room to handle more complex current-gen titles. Even still, there are likely to be many other hangups. Storage speed, RAM, and CPU power among them. But perhaps there may be room for new impossible ports on future hardware that don't make such stark image quality concessions. On a more basic level, upgraded hardware could potentially revitalize some of the more challenging software from the Switch's existing library. Recent Microsoft and Sony systems have given older software the ability to run with higher clock rates and greater access to system resources. A hypothetical Switch 2 might allow older games to run like this, maximizing frame rate and dynamic resolutions in the process. That all depends, of course, on Nintendo following industry conventions, of which there is no guarantee. But years of Switch modding has revealed that most software runs perfectly fine even with heavy system-level overclocks applied. The prospect of getting demanding software like The Witcher 3 running at 720p in portable mode on a future Switch without any new patches or updated software releases is tantalizing indeed, but we'll have to see which road Nintendo takes. For now though, the original Switch is a great hybrid system that can still deliver good-looking graphics on the go, but some software simply pushes the console too hard. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.